Hi, I'm Cara Sofoko, and this is Over the Top, Under the Radar, a weekly look at the stories in the news that are being over-reported and the ones that are flying completely under the radar and not being talked about enough. This episode is brought to you by Power to Change to celebrate Community Business Week, which starts on the 29th of November. This week's show takes a look at one topic making all the headlines this week and one that tends to fly under the radar. I'm joined by Pat Younge to talk about the BBC and former First Minister of Wales, Vaughan Gething, to talk about Welsh politics. I am joined by Pat Younge, who is former Chief Creative Officer at the BBC and has 30 years of broadcasting experience, both at the BBC and at commercial entities. Hi, Pat. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Karis. Thanks for having me.
You're a long-time friend of the show and you are a relation to Gary Younge. You are his older brother.
He is my younger and more famous brother. That is true, but he knows nothing about broadcasting. So there you are.
So those of you who are Patreon supporters will know Pat because he is, I'm a founding member of Over Under and a very generous Patreon supporter. I mean, most people listening to the show will be familiar with the story scandal kind of engulfing the BBC. Could you just sort of boil it down for us quickly? What's happened and why is there so much noise and fury?
The BBC is a public service broadcaster which is funded by a universal licence fee or levy which everybody pays, and nearly everybody pays. It's long been the target of attack, especially from people on the right, especially newspaper groups on the right, who feel that especially the BBC's website interferes with their marketplace, but also there are people on the right who do not like the underlying sort of purpose ethos of the BBC and believe that it is inveterably biased towards the left. There's a constant ongoing sort of war, and the BBC's made mistakes. It's made mistakes in the highly disputed territory of the war in Gaza. It's made mistakes over its coverage of everything from pop stars to the whole debate around transgender rights. But because it is a public broadcaster, those mistakes and those issues are argued out in public. But it allows those on the right to claim that the BBC has a left-wing bias. So cut to the chase in terms of what's happened now. Basically, the Daily Telegraph, which is a very right-leaning newspaper in the UK, published a so-called secret dossier of editorial complaints about BBC coverage which had been made by an advisor to the BBC, and he claimed they hadn't been acted upon. One of the complaints was about an edit in a film about Donald Trump, which basically cut together two things that he said 50 minutes apart in his speech on January the 6th. It started with him saying, let's go up to the Capitol building, and ended with, let's fight, fight, fight. It wasn't made clear that that was an edit, and this was seized upon as another example of BBC bias. And even though nobody complained about it when it went out the first time, after this report was made, there were something like 500 complaints. This is where it gets interesting. So the head of news at the BBC makes a decision that they should apologise. But for some reason, she is not allowed to make that apology. The board won't allow her to make that apology. And one of the big questions is, why couldn't she make the apology? One, she's the head of news, so that should give her authority in and of its own status to make an apology. So who blocked her and why? The guy that certainly is having all of the fingers pointed at him is a guy called Robbie Gibb. Robbie is a former press secretary for Theresa May, a former Conservative Prime Minister. He was put on the board of the BBC by Boris Johnson. He helped found GB News, and at some stage, and maybe even now, was listed at Companies House as the owner of the Jewish Chronicle newspaper. Robbie's background is journalism, and he claims to be the journalistic integrity voice on the BBC board. So a lot of people are claiming that it's Robbie Gibb that essentially is the problem. No one knows because we can't get underneath what happened at the board meeting. But by the end of this process, basically, after a week of the BBC not responding, saying that it was going to put it all in a response to Parliament, both the head of news and the head of the BBC both resigned. We're all trying to work out why and what it means.
That's a really great summary, and I've got so many follow-up questions. It's getting so much attention. It's kind of the main story dominating the news and political agenda. And there is always a degree, this podcast is always looking at what gets covered in the media. And there is always a degree to which stories about the media get written about a lot by the media, which sort of makes sense. Journalists want to write about themselves, and, and so the BBC covers the BBC, the Guardian covers the BBC, the Telegraph covers the BBC. What do you think about this specific thing? Is it because it was Donald Trump? Like, why has this caught fire? Or do you think there's extra information that we're just missing?
It's incredibly disproportionate given what everybody's arguing over, because it is the effective decapitation of the leadership of the BBC in terms of the head of the BBC and the head of news, both going. It's important right now because the BBC only has a 10-year charter, only has permission to exist on 10-year cycles. And so it's important because the BBC is literally weeks away from entering into negotiations with the government about the new charter. This is one of the vulnerabilities of the BBC. This 10-year life cycle means that it's always open to should it continue or not, which makes it always open to political pressure. The other piece of this is that it's happening right now when we face an unprecedented period in terms of what media looks like. Yeah, the world's richest man owns X or Twitter. Elon Musk owns Twitter. The world's second richest man, Larry Ellison, will be on the board of TikTok USA, and his company will be the data provider for TikTok USA. He also owns CBS and Paramount. The world's third richest man, Mark Zuckerberg, owns Meta, Facebook, and WhatsApp. The fourth richest man owned Amazon, Amazon Prime, the Washington Post, Amazon Web Services, and the fifth and sixth own YouTube and Google. So all of the platforms that people use to discover, consume, and share content are in the hands of 6 private American individuals, many of whom lean extremely towards the right. The BBC is the bulwark against that. The BBC is something which is owned by all of us and is there to work in the public interest as opposed to the private interest. Therefore, the BBC is not just a counterpoint to them, it is a threat to them, and it is a threat to that business model, and it is a threat to the authoritarian playbook, which is about getting everybody to distrust everything so that their news becomes the news. So the stakes aren't higher than they've ever been, and I know people say that all the time, but they really are, because we've never seen this concentration of media power in private hands.
You've worked in the BBC. There are always complaints about BBC coverage. There are always accusations of bias, often from both left and right. To you, this does feel different. And is it the overall media landscape and how unique the BBC is?
Well, it is very different because the basis of the claim of a lack of impartiality from this guy, Michael Prescott, who was brought in as an editorial advisor. I mean, part of his analysis, for example, when looking at the American elections, was the BBC's use of the word reproductive rights was actually sympathetic to the left and was an example of BBC bias because reproductive rights is an expression used by the liberals in the United States. He also feels that the BBC's coverage of Trump saying that Haitians were eating their cats and dogs was disproportionate and another example of BBC bias. So he sees bias in places where most of us don't see bias at all. And that's even allowing for my own personal biases. The idea that reproductive rights is a liberal term and whereas to him it is loaded. He argued that the BBC should meet with a group called History Reclaimed. They're the ones who are very active in taking on the National Trust because they claim that too much emphasis has been given to the other side of empire as regards slavery and colonialism. So he is a culture warrior in all but name. So the idea that he was brought in, all right, I get the idea you bring in different points of view, but the idea that his dossier is neutral is really for the birds. So, and it turns out from Samir Shah's response, many of the things he raised, the BBC had actually done the investigation themselves. And it then came down to his analysis of what they'd found compared to other people's analysis. So that's why I feel that this one is different. I think it is more orchestrated. When Tim Davie and Deborah Turner's resignations are announced, Donald Trump says basically, hey, I brought down the head and the head of news at the BBC. And then the White House, the home of the president of the free world, says the BBC is fake news. Everyone should watch GB News. Now, if that doesn't tell you where this is coming from, nothing will.
You've hit on a good point there, because there's so much coverage of this story and of the psychodrama and of Trump. But the owner of GB News also owns The Spectator, a man called Paul Marshall. And you've touched on it, but I think it is worth putting out to people. There's this sort of unholy alliance of anti-BBC forces. There are people who own other commercial media entities like GB News that are competitors with the BBC. And then there are sort of right-wing ideologues who believe that the BBC is a lefty organisation.
And who is the main presenter on GB News?
Farage.
Nigel Farage. Who is a friend of Trump? Nigel Farage. Who owns the Daily Telegraph? An investment house called Redbird. Who owns Paramount CBS, or who are investors in Paramount CBS? Redbird. This is classic sort of capitalist sort of concentration of wealth and power in very few hands over sort of crucial platforms that we need to communicate, or which have now dominated how we communicate with each other.
Some people listening will be left-wing and will say that the BBC is biased to the right, and might even say, why should I stand up for the BBC? I don't think its coverage is good. I'm annoyed about Gaza. I'm annoyed about coverage of gender identity. And a lot of people have specific issues and beef with reporters like Laura Kuenssberg, often comes in for criticism from the left. Like, what would you say to someone with left-wing politics listening, being like, good riddance, I don't care?
People who are trying to take the BBC down are all coming from the other side of that argument, because we don't have newspapers. We don't have social media platforms. You know, the head of X said there was going to be a civil war in Britain, is funding Tommy Robinson's legal fees, and says Keir Starmer should be ousted. That is the head of a distribution platform which broadcasts into the UK. If they look at the actual complaint, there was some stuff going on at BBC Arabic which was egregious and needed to be stopped, and the BBC have stepped in and have made changes. But to argue that all of the BBC's coverage of the events in Gaza was anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic, which is what Prescott argues, is, again, for the birds. So the BBC has to be better at dealing with complaints. It has to better understand the nature of the media world we work in. The world doesn't wait 7 days for the BBC to craft a response. You know, and if Deborah was ready to respond the next day, that should have happened. In part, this is a problem of the BBC's own making, because they created a vacuum by not responding to the substantive points. And into that vacuum, all of the other malign forces stepped.
You know, there are public service broadcasters in other countries, but the BBC is quite unique. It is overwhelmingly and consistently the most trusted source of news for people in the UK and in other countries. But the American equivalent, PBS, has nowhere near the reach or the trust. And there is, I guess sometimes I think about the BBC as a bit like the NHS. It's this institution that was built decades ago and isn't perfect, but it is something that we as a country should be proud of, and like a net positive.
People are proud of it. And I mean, the BBC just did its own survey through an agency of something like 850,000 people, right? The BBC is still used by over 80% of people as a trusted source of news. It still delivers the biggest entertainment shows on television, whether that's Traitors or Strictly. And it still delivers comprehensive local news, local coverage. It delivers the World Service. One of the reasons that many of us thought Trump would come for the BBC eventually is the BBC is the most trusted source of news in the United States. The only thing which is trusted more than the BBC is the Weather Channel. So, given Trump's playbook, he's gone for CBS. His man, who's now owned CBS, is out to try and buy CNN. He went for Jimmy Kimmel. He goes for all of his critics all the time. Trump coming for the BBC in some way or other was inevitable. This stupid edit has made it slightly easier for him to try and get some purchase, but it was inevitable. It was going to come at some point, because Trump's whole game is about winnowing out the institutions that could stand in his way.
The interesting thing we're seeing now, we're recording this on Wednesday evening, so that, the story is broken, it's developing, is, do you think that Trump's threats to sue the BBC could backfire? We're seeing Ed Davey and other people standing up for the BBC and saying, because it is bullying, isn't it? It's that he's like taken this
He's a
one
grifter.
ruling, and yeah, he's a grifter. And it's the thing I find is, like, I actually just find it really hard to watch because I feel like I wish the BBC had like a bit more backbone. The right-wing attacks on the BBC are real and they have been consistent. There's this iteration, but I mean, the main enemy of the BBC for decades has been Rupert Murdoch and his empire. So this idea of right-wing forces and commercial forces sort of coming for the BBC, always trying to clip its wings, always saying it's doing too much because, basically it costs some rich people money, and some right-wing people have decided that the BBC just, in the same way that they'll say the civil service is left-wing, they say the BBC is biased. So, but I think the thing I find hard is just like, it feels like the BBC rolls over a lot to this and then actually ends up being biased towards right-wing perspective because they're the ones that are attacking it. Do you share that frustration, or do you think their hands are tied?
I share that frustration. Having been inside the BBC, when you are constantly being attacked, somebody's attacking them over the use of the word reproductive rights. They didn't concede on that. But when you're fighting on so many fronts, sometimes you do have to make concessions because otherwise you wouldn't get anything done. And part of the art is, do they have a case? If they have a case, did we make an error? If we made an error, how do we, first of all, apologise? Secondly, learn. 3, make good. They're under constant attack. But the BBC speaks for a silent majority, but that majority is silent.
Potentially, it's still a live story and it's still developing, but it feels now like there might be a backlash to Trump and that he might have overplayed his hand. What do you think?
Yeah, Trump stepping in and demanding $1 billion from the BBC has definitely, in my book, in my view, helped the BBC. One, because, again, another example of his ridiculous grifter mindset. Secondly, the idea that Donald Trump says, I'm truth and the BBC is lies, even with this ridiculous edit, is just, nonsensical. And thirdly, when we talk about the right, it's a rather amorphous thing. People, who reads the Daily Telegraph and all the rest of it, when you say Donald Trump says GB News is the answer, people go, oh, okay, I understand what's at stake now. I understand, what these forces are. So Trump coming out in the way in which he has, I think ultimately is helpful for the BBC, providing they do not pay him a penny. And I know people at the BBC, a lot of them think they're very clever, and they say, we won't pay him, but we will pay his fees, and we maybe will do a charity thing, or we'll let them have X hours of such and such time. They just have to say, we are not paying you a dime, and that is it. And if that isn't good enough for you, we will see you in court. Because one, he doesn't have a legal case to stand on. The show only aired in the UK, and he's out of time to sue in the UK. That they're now saying, well, some people watched it on BBC iPlayer in Miami or Florida. Well, they would have had to do that through a VPN. That is illegal and goes around the BBC's attempts to keep it in one place. His other part of his claim is that they tried to tip the scales of the election and it's cost him reputationally and financially. Well, reputationally, Boris Johnson, amongst others, after January the 6th, said basically Trump was an incendiary in terms of what happened that day. Reputationally, a congressional commission found that Trump, not only through his election denial, but also his actions on the day, were a major factor in the attempted sort of takeover of Congress. And in terms of financially, he's grifted his way to billions whilst he's been in the White House. There's no evidence that it affected him financially at all. So even if he could find a way of getting into court, there's nothing on the merits that suggests he would win. And in the end, it's better for the BBC to go to court and lose than to do the preemptive give this guy anything that he wants.
So for people who are listening and just feel, well, I guess depressed or sort of overwhelmed by it, what is there? I know you're involved in an organisation called the British Broadcasting Challenge. What can people do who care about the BBC and are worried that it's under attack?
Well, first of all, we just need to speak up to the BBC. Despite its imperfections, it's certainly better than anything else out there. And if you look at the future in terms of Musk and Zuckerberg and Bezos, it's better than anything which is to come. And I realise for some people that will be hold your nose, and say, I still support the BBC. But it honestly is the best to any of the alternatives. Secondly, there is going to be a new charter. As you said, I chair the British Broadcasting Challenge. It's a classic British small bunch of do-gooders, liberal do-gooders who believe in public service broadcasting as a public benefit and as something which is good for society and societal cohesion. We've published a paper which calls for all appointments to the BBC board to be independent of government. They won't be politically independent. Everybody has politics, and the BBC needs people on board who understand and who have politics. But we need an independent recruitment process to actually select members of the BBC board so that they're not chosen by the DCMS and some of them by Downing Street. The BBC needs to be funded fairly and at scale. It's lost over 30% of its money in the last 10 years. And it's not surprising when people are trying to maintain those levels of output on less and less money that corners get cut. And it needs a forever charter. Get rid of this 10-year sword of Damocles that holds over the BBC.
Well, I'm intrigued by that. What is the rationale for a 10-year charter?
It's just always had a 10-year charter. Every 10 years say, well, should we carry on with having an NHS or should we do something different? So give the BBC a forever charter. Let's take that off the table. That will also insulate it against Farage and the Faragists ever come into power. And what it also has will be a 10-year operating agreement, which is every 10 years, Parliament would sit down and agree with the BBC what it does, what its remit is, and what we expect of it. If we can do that and shift the BBC's relationship with the people to Parliament as opposed to the executive, we can go some way to insulating the BBC, not just from party politics on a day-to-day basis, but also from the prospect of an authoritarian, be that Farage or somebody else, ever coming into power in terms of the executive and trying to take control of the public broadcaster.
To the extent that we know, what is Reform's attitude to the BBC? I mean, obviously, Farage works for and makes quite a lot of money out of being on a competitor, GB News. Like, should we be worried if Reform win?
Yeah, of course we should be worried, because history shows us that when right-wing and authoritarian parties come to power, shutting down and curtailing the freedom of broadcasters is one of the first things they do. Trump defunded PBS and he defunded NPR and he defunded Voice of America. So we should be concerned, especially as at the moment, Downing Street and DCMS have the power to put people directly onto the board. So we need to break that link. We need to democratize that link, have a proper public approvals process with the successful candidates going in front of a select committee. That's fine. That's Parliament. It's not the executive. We want people who volunteer to serve, and we want them selected against the highest possible criteria and with the fewest possible conflicts of interest. Robbie Gibb may have been an outstanding journalist, and I don't have an issue de facto with him having been Theresa May's press secretary. But all of the other baggage that he brings, how can the founding member of GB News be on the board of the BBC as an appointment of the Prime Minister? How does that work? And Lisa Nandy says that since he's been appointed, she got to remove him. So even though his name has come up constantly, there are very limited grounds on which you can remove an appointed board member at the BBC. I know governance sounds really boring and, a bit, but actually this is a public body and we need to treat it with a bit more respect.
This episode is brought to you by Power to Change to celebrate Community Business Week, which starts on the 29th of November. Sometimes changing the world starts with changing something in your local area. Power to Change backs the people running community businesses, whether it's a pub, farm, library, or leisure centre. Running from the 29th of November to the 5th of December, Community Business Week is a national celebration of the businesses that make our local areas vibrant, resilient, and inclusive. If you live in Gateshead, Newcastle, Manchester, Bristol, or Birmingham, there are events that you can attend throughout the week. And if not, you can find out about community businesses near you by visiting powertochange.org.uk or searching #Community Business Week to find out more. This week, I am joined by Vaughan Gething, who is a member of the Senedd for Cardiff, South and Penarth and former First Minister of Wales. Hi, Vaughan. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, good afternoon. Good to meet you.
Yeah, lovely to meet you. I should have said Shemai.
Shemai, Diane.
You're a Welsh Labour politician. We're 25 years into devolution in Wales, and Welsh Labour is very dominant in Wales ever since we've had devolution. So sort of 25 years, every single First Minister we've had has been from the Labour Party. We've got Senedd elections coming up next year, and there's a lot of national attention on them because of how well Reform is polling. And I wonder if you had any reflections as a Welsh Labour politician about why suddenly Wales is in the spotlight and why Reform are doing so well.
I think there's two things about why Welsh Labour is now in the spotlight. The first is that, frankly, media outside Wales has just been bloody lazy and have just taken it for granted that Welsh Labour will be in charge and haven't really bothered to look at that in any objective way. Whereas the SNP winning successive Scottish parliamentary elections has been a story. Welsh Labour winning successive elections as it gets harder and harder to do that just hasn't been a story. So now, and it's one of those other things where I really do feel that people are so much more interested in bad news or difficult news. The good news of winning an election isn't the story. The fact that we might lose the next election, actually, that's a story that people outside Wales are interested in. And that comes with the rise of Reform as well. And I think we're getting the tail of that more populist politics later than other parts of the democratic world. If you look at mainstream Europe, we'd have thought that lots of countries that are successful liberal societies and democracies with a small L liberal, actually they've had the populist right in varying forms as a significant player in their politics for a long time. Think about Denmark, think about Sweden, think about the Netherlands as well. Part of our challenge, though, with the rise of Reform is I think it speaks to the fact that lots of people are unhappy with their current lot and are, even more important, are worried about the future. If you're optimistic about the future, I think politics works for you or can work for you, that's different. Actually, Reform are a really disruptive populist movement who are basically saying the political establishment have failed you. If you want something different, if you want to shake the tree, we're your people. And they're gaining more traction, if you like, left populist groups like the Greens, for example. Reform are getting lots more of that attention. That isn't just a story about the collapse of the Tory party. I think it is about the fact that we've got so many disruptive challenges about how we live our life and what the future looks like. I think it's easy to see why a movement in that space has got some traction. The challenge is what we do or don't do about it.
You're right. There are bigger, broader trends around the populist right, and it feels like no one is immune to them, certainly in Europe and lots of Western Europe. But I think, and I'll declare an interest, my mum's Welsh, and I spent a lot of time in South Wales as a child and still
A
go and visit
fabulous Welsh
family.
name.
Yeah, I have a very fabulous Welsh name. Would have been Geraint if I was a boy. My brother's called Dewi, so got very proud Welsh heritage. I think I was, and I know I wasn't alone in being surprised at the rise of Reform, partly just because they have not historically had a very Welsh presence. So, I think I'm right in saying there's still not a Welsh leader of Reform. And, one of our listeners had a question about the extent to which Reform has felt very English and not sort of British, wrapping themselves in the St. George's Cross. And I guess one of our listener questions was, why hasn't that backfired in Wales? And why do you think Reform has managed to get traction, even though I know Nigel Farage was sort of strutting around carefully before he realised he wasn't going to win the by-election, but it has felt a little bit sort of discordant.
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. And actually, I don't accept that it's correct to simply say the Reform is an English enterprise. There's lots that is very English about them. But, they have voting blocks in Scotland and in Wales as well. If you go back to UKIP and the Brexit Party, you've got similar voting blocks that have actually expanded a bit as well. We had 6 UKIP members before they imploded and turned into different things. So actually, there is a history of people voting for them as a disruptive party. And, that single issue around Brexit has expanded outwards in a critique that actually, the part of the promise for Brexit was, if your life's terrible, why vote for more of the same? And there was a positive argument made for Brexit that actually our life can be better outside Europe. It's Europe that's holding us back. The argument now is that the promise hasn't been delivered because essentially there's a Remainer stitch-up that stopped it from happening. It's broadly put in those terms. When you look at it, there are people who are just interested in the critique that our country doesn't feel like it used to. I'm not confident that my future is a better one, whether you're in work or retired. And if I want my kids and my grandkids to have a better future, do I just sit and let this happen? So you've got a number of people that were never really engaged in politics. They're a bit more engaged with the opportunity to give everyone a kicking at the ballot box. And you've got, I think, a real challenge for established parties on the centre left and the centre right to actually re-establish trust, which I think has been shattered as well in lots of the way politics doesn't work. But also to show that the challenges we face as a country here in Wales and across the UK can be resolved by politics working properly. Well, there's an understanding of what life is like. The fact that life isn't very good for a number of people, the fact that people are worried about the future, and there's reason for that, but that actually the way that politics works can change that for the better. Now, that I think is a challenge for all of us and not just for one party.
The reality is Wales lost a huge amount of money when Brexit happened. And as much as there have been improvements in productivity and skills, you know, there have also been jobs that have lost. The Port Talbot Steelworks, which we thought maybe Labour coming into power nationally would change. Presumably, the feeling that Reform are tapping into is the sense that in Wales, there aren't the opportunities that there used to be. It's harder to get well-paying work. Presumably, you have to leave and go to London or to another big city in order to have the opportunities that other people in the country have. Is that failure of the national government? Is that a failure of devolution? Like that sense of malaise and sense that things aren't going well is rooted in some reality.
Yeah, look, so that painful structural change, and the steelworks couldn't be saved because Tata weren't prepared to reconsider where they were. They got to the point with their plans, it was too late. And that came despite the fact that a UK Labour government was prepared to put lots more money on the table to save those jobs and to deliver a transition in a very different way. Now, I think the broader point around do you need to get out to get on? I don't think you do, but I think we need a much clearer and more optimistic vision, and a vision with some ambition about the future of the economy, the sort of jobs we can have. You know, we know that in the next 10 to 15 years, we'll not just have demonstrators of floating offshore wind, we'll see more of that deployed. Where will the turbines be built? Where will the steel for the platforms be made? That's both a UK choice and a choice for Wales as well. We're going to need to have investment in our port infrastructure for that to happen. Those should be jobs, not just the operations and maintenance side of it, because you kind of have to do some of that near to where your turbines are. But actually, you can do much more than that. So capturing that and not just turning that theory into practice, I think will be really important.
We have these flashpoints where Wales becomes interesting to sort of Westminster media, and the Caerphilly by-election, one of them a couple of weeks ago. A friend was in Caerphilly for the count and said there was this army of journalists that had come in from London. He almost looked a bit disappointed that Reform hadn't won. Plaid Cymru obviously won that seat. The Labour campaign was, as far as I could see, vote us to stop Reform. So is that what you're talking about, that right now that Welsh Labour's offer is kind of vote us to stop Reform, you know, we're the only ones who can beat them, as opposed to this is what we can do for Wales?
Well, actually, Plaid Cymru's message was, actually, it's us who can stop Reform, so vote for us.
I mean, it was everyone's message, wasn't it? It wasn't a bad shout in the end.
On doorsteps, people made a choice about who they thought was best placed to do that in very large measure. Plaid Cymru also had a well-known candidate stood for the seat on 13 previous occasions, so it didn't need reintroducing. And we had our own internal challenges, not just the fact that the MS Heaven David had died, but there was lots of internal fighting that spilled over into public. The Labour leader of the council resigned and backed Plaid Cymru. That's not a usual setting for a by-election. I think our offer is both about the fact that we are not Reform. It is also got to be about what's our positive offer. What do we take from 26, it'll be 27 years in government, about how to improve Wales, and then to turn that into, as I said, 3 to 5 main areas to offer, saying this is how the future can be better. Because otherwise, you know, the public will make their choice. You can't expect people just to say, please be loyal to Labour and that's enough. And that should never be all we offer and ask for. We should be proud of our values, the fact that they're similar to the values of so many Welsh people, the fact that we are very much part of the history of the country, but much more, we've got to set out how we're part of the future of the country as well.
I mean, you've been in frontline politics for over a decade and you joined Labour, I think, when you were 17. What drew you to politics?
As I became a teenager, in particular, I became more aware of how the world saw me. And that changed my view on the world as well. The only family in my primary school that had children who weren't white was my family. And we're at least half of that number in our secondary school. So we're pretty visible and pretty hard to get away with stuff. But My father read a paper. I delivered lots of newspapers. When I stopped just reading the sport pages of the newspaper he bought, when I stopped resenting the fact he wanted to watch the news when he came home, when I saw the very different ways that the world covered things, and I started having more of my own views, I thought that there's lots in our country and our world that isn't fair. And I saw the Labour Party as the best vehicle for that social and economic change that I wanted, and where I saw my own values aligning.
You talked about growing up and being, the only mixed family or black family, and then one of a few black families. I think sometimes people romanticize Wales and kind of Welsh politics as really lefty. What's happened in terms of the anti-racist movement in Wales, and how much do you think this surge towards reform has a racial component, or is it just about people being unhappy with the economy? I mean, there's only one MS that is reform, and she's a Tory reform switcher, and she's made headlines recently for using a racist slur. To what extent is that what's going on with reform, or is it something different? I remember coming to Swansea when there was a National Front demo, and I think that sometimes there can be, a romanticisation of Wales and Welsh politics that ignores that slightly, and I wonder what you thought about that.
I think there's quite a lot of romanticisation that is nonsense. You only want to tell your best story sometimes. So you learn about America and the Civil War and the fight for racial justice. There are lots of people who want to talk about Welsh people involved on the right side of that. They don't want to talk about the fact that Jefferson Davis could have played rugby for Wales because of his Welsh heritage. They don't want to talk about African Americans who have Welsh surnames because when people were freed, they often were given the surname of their former owners. So that's why there are loads of African Americans who are called Williams and Jones and Evans. So there is something about our complicated history that I think we should tell both sides of and learn from both sides as well. I'm not asking for us to have a view on ourselves that is constantly sort of a hair-shirted, we've been terrible people in the past, but actually say, honestly, as in most countries in the world, we had people on the right and the wrong side of history. What does that mean today about our links with the rest of the world and who we want to be? And I think that does go into some of the challenges that I think I have found is that from the mid-90s onwards, I think there was quite a lot of significant change in attitudes. Overt racism, including homophobia and a range of other things, they definitely fell down. The challenge was, though, that those attitudes were still there with lots, but not everyone was a genuine convert. And as we've seen over the last 10 years or so, people are prouder to be overtly racist, overtly sexist, misogynist, and homophobic. So that rise has affected other people who broadly share some of those views, but aren't prepared to say it. I think it's a mistake to categorize reform as a movement that is founded in that shift in attitudes. I think there's quite a number of things that go along with it. It's partly because the Tory party destroyed itself, is still going through that process over its attitude to Europe. And Nigel Farage has always had a very distinct and clear, there's no compromise involved with him on whether Europe's a problem. But more than that, I think the economic challenge and the challenge of does politics work anymore, that sort of broader populist message you can get from the right or the left, he's also managed to channel into as well. I think the thing with Farage is that I think he has more problems when he strays over the country's in a mess and we're here to fix it. When he goes into trying to have answers, because then you've got to have answers that can work. And I don't think he's going to come with lots of policy answers. I don't think you're going to find an awful lot of that ahead of the election. You'll find it, Nigel's our guy and just vote for us.
I think, the interesting thing, I spoke to a Green Party official a few months ago, and they're really focusing on Wales and the Senate elections as well. And for those who don't know, there's proportional representation. So it's much easier for smaller parties to get represented in Wales. Farage has got this unique position, right? He gets to play by different rules because he's the shake up the system candidate. He's the I don't like it, none of the above, disrupt politics candidate. And in a sense, lots of people say we should scrutinise reform, where they are in power locally. But in a sense, even if there's loads of reform councils that have collapsed or been ineffective, he probably can still run as that outsider and insurgent candidate. You talked about Brexit. Why do you think that Wales voted for Brexit, even though, Wales specifically received millions and millions of pounds in transfers from from the European Union. Why is it that people in Wales didn't want to stay in the EU? Why did people vote for Brexit in Wales?
I think it's more than one thing. It's partly about not being proud enough of the investment that we got and not being able to say, look, this is because of our membership of the European Union. It's also, I think, because there's a number of things about the politics of Wales that are really similar to England. I think it's easy to tell yourself that there's a really distinct and different politics. Working class Welsh people are really similar to working class English people. Same thing with middle income Wales and middle income England. There's not a giant difference in the language, and the additional culture, the additional identity of being Welsh doesn't change people's fundamental views about work, the economy, and some wider values. I think that is sometimes overplayed. There is a difference. I think it's overplayed though. And I think a lot of people voted to leave because they thought that there might be a better life somewhere else. And because the proposition of leaving the EU was never set out in harder terms, it could mean what you wanted it to. Whereas actually being in was something that people knew and understood. And if you're told this is part of how your life is run, and trust me, it'll get worse if you leave. So a lot of people thought, well, my life's pretty poor anyway. Why shouldn't I give it a go? Because those people are telling me it can be better. And there are people who are just committed to leaving for a number of other reasons, regardless of the economics. There are some people who just thought, I think we'd be better off. Not all of those people are still around to make investment choices in Britain now that's happened. The reasons why people voted to leave are not simple and straightforward in the sense there isn't one reason. A lot of the people who thought that are still the reform curious voters today. And you won't persuade those people not to vote reform or to positively vote for someone else by telling them a story about reform are evil, they're desperate, they're awful people. It's like, but what do you have to offer? In fact, for some people, they'll just be more determined to support them, as you can't offer some critique about who they are really, but much more importantly, well, what would you do and what are you offering?
What do you think the answer is if you're from Welsh Labour?
We've got to be prepared to talk about the future. And we're lucky in the sense that we have a lot of actors who will go out and knock doors and want the country to be better and believe that our values and our approach will make the country a better place. But we've got to have something to offer in doing that and a positive message for the future. That means that the government here needs to make some choices about what they want to do whilst we're in the government, have the opportunity to say that, as well as a message for campaigning. And I don't think we should spend all of our time attacking reform. I think that is a mistake. You need to have lines about who reform are. And in particular, I think on the health service, where Nigel Farage says some very odd things that I don't think people in Wales would support. But don't send out 10 messages about them because people won't remember what you're saying. Something about them, much more about who we are and what we want to do.
It's really interesting, your reflections on the way in which, Welsh politics is similar to politics in other parts of the UK and to England. Specifically on the, everyone who's considering voting reform isn't racist. Some of them may be, former Brexiteers. Some of them may really care about immigration. Some of them may feel like their communities are falling apart and just there needs to be some sort of a change. I'm sure you saw, Tommy Robinson and the kind of far right had a huge demo in London. They're planning another one for next year. How much do you think that there is a component of the reform vote that is racist? Do you think that Tommy Robinson nationalist, racist tendency exists in Wales? Or do you think it's slightly different?
No, look, we've had far-right racist councillors. There were some in Swansea during my lifetime, during my adulthood. So, that's possible. And I think it goes back to one of your points about, is there a myth that we tell ourselves that Wales is a progressive nation where nothing bad ever happens? Actually, we've got our own share of deeply unpleasant people, including racists, in the population in Wales. And there's no point pretending otherwise, because otherwise you have a problem that you're not acknowledging it exists. There'll be Welsh people who went to that Tommy Robinson demo, I'm sure. And I'm sure if he has another one, there'll be people in Wales who go to that again. They don't stop being Welsh because they've gone to that demo. Our challenge is what we're prepared to do about it. There's something about restaking and standing up for our values. There's also something, again, about if that's the angle you want to take to try and attack reform, I think that is fraught with difficulty. Because reform can and will wheel out a whole range of people who aren't racists, but just don't think the country works. and they'll have a range of black and Asian people saying, I'm offended that you're saying I'm a member of a racist party. I am not. There will probably be stories about individual candidates in more than one party who have said and done racist things. And, Laura Ann Jones, who had a standards report coming to the Senate next week with a recommendation to be banned for 14 days. She made a series of racist comments. She was a Tory when she did that. So, this isn't something that is uniquely in one party, but it is a part of our politics. You've got to be prepared to take on and expose. My view is that you should not go after Reform and say they're a racist party. You should be prepared to call them out when you identify the racists in their ranks, just as you would do with the Tories. But actually, the bigger and the stronger critique of Reform, I think, is that they are a party of protest and they're not serious. If you want the country to work, that can't be Reform. If you care about the health service, look at what their leaders kept on saying about it. If you want the country to work, here's what we offer. I love my country and I want my country to be successful. And that is also part of, I think, one of the things we have to get used to is that with all the stuff around flags, I think the real risk is the people who see themselves as being on the left of politics run away from that. It's like, actually, that dragon belongs to me. So does the Union Jack. I'm not giving that up to people on the most obnoxious side of politics. I love my country, and that's why I'm prepared to fight for it.
Thank you for listening to Over the Top, Under the Radar. This episode is brought to you by Power to Change to celebrate Community Business Week, which starts on the 29th of November.